brother. Although the last time I saw him, he had a hat on because he was master of his lodge. Past master, worshipful brother Tim Sheils. Welcome to the Craftsmen Online podcast.
Thank you. And depending on what year you saw me, I might have had hair and not a beard. So it's been going back and forth.
Actually, I
Been a rough
wasn't
couple years.
going to point that out. But yeah, you did have the beard, and the hair on top of your head was about as long as the beard hair for our YouTube live streamers that are watching along. Unfortunately, I've rocked the same haircut since 2012, so no big change for me there. But what was the inspiration? Just a summer cut, or
It's self-thinning, so it was bound to happen anyway. And even going into it, if we've got our past masters portraits on the wall. My first year, clean cut, clean shaven, everything. That was the year COVID hit, and I was like, all right, let's just go full feral. And then the next year is just looking like Albert Pike. And so I was just saying that's a cautionary tale, never to do 2 years sequentially in the East.
actually, I'm going to see if they can get that added to, worshipful brother Tim Sheils, and then in quotes, full feral underneath that master's portrait. I love
I
that.
try to keep my portraits as out of date as possible now.
Nice. Well, one of the things that isn't out of date, and the reason why you're on this podcast, ironically, it is something that was kind of a byproduct of that 2020 COVID era, was the Me Too movement, which still exists today when it comes to where we fit in as Freemasons and kind of this role of masculinity, which I'm sure that title, guys are like, whoa, what is all this about? And, you and I were kind of talking about when you first put this program out, or sort of doing the research into it, the wave, so to speak, was still traveling to shore, and now we've kind of got the slapback going into the ocean. So take us back to those initial days when you saw all of this happening. What inspired you to tackle this topic, and how was it received by the brothers of your lodge?
Yeah, so this was the first presentation that I actually gave in my lodge, and this was before I was in the East. So this would have been 2018 or 2019. So relatively, um, not long after the Me Too movement first started, which was, in 2017 when it really hit Twitter. And I remember, well, so there's kind of two main things that inspired this. So the first one was, um, Gillette, the shaving company, made a commercial that kind of was extremely focused on the Me Too movement. And I don't remember seeing the commercial, but I saw articles about it, and I was like, "What's up with this commercial?" And because it was one of the first, almost like culture war kind of things, at least that I had noticed, where people were really getting up in arms about this commercial by a shaving cream company. And so, I look at it on YouTube, and I'm like, all right, um, the whole point of it is that this whole idea of boys will be boys, be manly men, needs to change. And, the only thing from that commercial that exists to this day, because they pulled it from YouTube, is that meme of like the one guy holding his friend back, that kind of shows up. And the idea was that, this whole time of catcalling and bullying needs to stop. So that was part one. The other part was the Me Too movement, where Alyssa Milano posted on Twitter her experiences and said, if you've experienced this too, do the hashtag Me Too. I'm not on Twitter, X now, whatever they want to call it. But I remember seeing on Facebook, a surprising number of people posting Me Too, and so it was both this idea of people are getting up in arms about this commercial that's saying don't do this stuff,
Mm.
and it's happening to a lot of people that I know. And so part of it too, with getting to the presentation within the lodge, it's like, so there's this extremely controversial commercial, but if you strip back any of the environment around it, the Me Too movement, because men were getting very defensive. So then there became like not all men, and a whole bunch of different oh, I'm not like that, so it's irrelevant. So there was a lot of backlash because people were getting defensive about it. And so I thought, okay, why not take this idea, and see because we don't talk politics in Masonry, but you can still talk social issues. And I wanted to see if I could frame this in a way that was Masonic. And the first version of this presentation I did focused, besides the some of the history, on areas in the lectures, in the charges that kind of remind you, hey, don't be a jerk,
Mm,
and so I thought it was an interesting exercise to be able to present that in a lodge with a diverse group of guys and see how what people got from it. You know if you can see this commercial without having seen a Fox News or an MSNBC story about it, like if you see it going in blind, what does that do to you? And yeah, at the same time, it was 2018, so I had a 2-year-old son, my first kid. So it was like, do I want my kid to be the one on the ground
mm,
being punched, or I want my kid to be the one punching somebody? I mean, they do karate now, so, but it's what, and a large part of that commercial is, what are we doing with this next generation? How do we teach boys to be men? And I think that is, um, Masonry. It's for men, but what are we teaching men to do in Masonry?
You touched a lot of things there on that opening answer, which I
Yeah.
love. I mean, first we hopped in the time machine, we traveled back to 2017, and this Me Too, this was the movement that brought down Harvey Weinstein. He was like the public enemy number one. He became the
He's
face of
back.
this.
He's got a retrial that just started this week. So
It's
again, we
crazy.
talked about the wave pulling back, where these consequences have not been permanent. Everybody decrying cancel culture. It was more like lay low for a while culture, although Harvey Weinstein's still in jail.
Mm,
But a lot of the movement kind of, it just became another way of fracturing people, of like, oh, you support kind of this side of the argument versus another. And
right.
so, yeah, that's kind of with like the culture wars that have been going on, is of, where do we go from here?
And that's what makes it interesting, because Freemasonry, as you also touched on, is like, we're supposed to kind of stay in the middle. As a matter of fact, we're actually not even supposed to be in the middle. We're supposed to be on the sidelines, where politics and all the things from the profane world should not be coming into our lodges. And as you mentioned, you were a newly raised Master Mason at Silver Spring Lodge number 215 in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of the nation's capital. You're relatively a new dad, right?
Yeah.
And here you are with your first program or presentation that you're going to give to Lodge. And while most people would expect, oh, we have brother Tim, he's only been doing this for a few years, he's going to get up and give his first program. It's probably going to be on one of the working tools of any of our degrees. Nothing wrong with any of that.
Right.
And here you are tackling this. Like, what did your Lodge brothers think about, or what were they saying to you after you gave this program?
I mean, it went really well within Lodge. Nobody stood up and walked out, so that's
That's a
always
win. Yeah.
a benefit. And we did have a good conversation about it, because the the main thrust of the talk was, these are experiences that have happened to people that I know.
Mm,
This is a commercial that teaches us how to behave. This is why I would want to apply that to my life. And here's lessons from our degrees that I've taken in. So, if you have it about things that I've learned, things that I've experienced, it may not be what people agree with, but you can't really argue that, yes, friends that I know have posted Me Too. So, and I guess maybe being closer to to DC, we do have a more diverse lodge than other lodges that I visited, and that becomes a strength, because people are used to other viewpoints and don't get all up in arms about it. I've seen um, similar presentations like this about like masculinity and masonry, and they're kind of on the other side of the coin, where it's, here's what some of these issues are, here's some of the problems. And it wasn't that we need to treat people better, it was that here's society's ills, and this is what's causing this problem. So depending on where you're at, you can get different versions of it,
mm.
and different people who have different thoughts about it.
Just like any guest that comes on our program or any speaker that I see in a lodge, like inside my mind, I have, the standard work and lecture, our ritual book from the Grand Lodge of New York. I also have, DC's ritual up there scattered about in places too. But in my mind, I kind of take a highlighter. And as soon as the speaker starts or the guest or the brother starts talking, I'm highlighting to connect parts of our ritual that I know that we're instructed or that we're told certain things, the lessons about being a Freemason. And for this particular topic, I immediately started thinking of the EA charge, where we're told to be a good citizen. I think of the obligation, the part in the Fellowcraft degree when it comes to how we will treat female family members of brothers. I also think about, in the third degree, just the idea of the role of spreading the love of brotherly cement, so to speak, across all people and living in harmony. Did any of our Masonic ritual, or were there any parts of what we do as Freemasons that influenced your presentation?
Um, looking back at kind of the first iteration of this presentation that I had done, while it was focusing a lot on the degrees themselves, I did pull out a few areas. We talk about the 4 cardinal virtues, and between the liberal arts and sciences and the cardinal virtues, those are kind of 2 of the presentations that I've made that I give the most. And looking through the cardinal virtues, we've got temperance, fortitude, justice. See, I've been out of the East for too long.
Don't look to me for help.
Yeah, well, yeah, we can edit that part out. But we talk about the virtues, and actually even the 4 cardinal virtues are the less important ones in terms of how we treat other people. It's more how we comport ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the theological virtues, there we go. That's the one I'm stumbling on. So the theological virtues, the faith, hope, and charity in our degree, but it really is better translated as love. So, you have all that, and that's kind of, if you're treating people with love, then, you're not catcalling people on the street. You're not just, being unnecessarily aggressive to people and that sort of thing.
Mm.
And then, continuing with that theme of the virtues, I gave a presentation for the Scottish Rite about the virtues, and I'm newly Scottish Rite, so I was trying to figure out how I can just some sort of way smash this into what little I know about the Scottish Rite. And one of the main questions I've always had with the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, why are we teaching these in lodge? Why are they a big chunk of the first degree that you get? And within the structure, we talk about these virtues. There's virtues that are common in every culture, so that was a big part of it too. It's not necessarily a European Christian based idea. There you can find cardinal virtues or core virtues in every society. So it's important to be able to take what you learn in Masonry and remind yourself and others that it applies to other people throughout the world. And then, within the Scottish Rite, we love knighting each other. You get knighted a whole bunch of different times.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of like this next step of being virtuous, is that you become chivalric. So you get these knightly virtues. And so it was following this trail of, if we're being virtuous, if our goal as Masons is to be virtuous, what does virtuous mean? So digging back, I got my Latin corrected because it's virtus or vir, which is fulfilling, virtus is all the qualities of men. And so that's basically like the virtues that we're talking about. And then with that, the idea of, and this is kind of jumping ahead to like the masculinity and manliness part, but if you are to be a good man, if you're going to be a manly man, then you are a virtuous man. And that's really, I should have saved this for the end, because that's like the key.
Oh, don't worry, we'll get there.
So yeah, maybe I can say cleaner by then, but that's kind of the main goal of what I think masculinity is, and a lot of the other presentations I'd seen, it kind of danced around that because
Mm.
what is this masculinity that we're talking about?
That's a good point. We're talking about the Me Too movement. We're talking about the Me Too movement, Masonry, and masculinity with worshipful brother Tim Sheils. And with your presentation, I was also thinking of just Freemasonry in general. I go back to, especially in America, how we've been tied to the beginning of the birth of our country, but also Masons at key points in time have been in leadership or in positions of authority where they can speak or take actions for others. And I was thinking of like the women's suffrage movement, for example, the Civil Rights Act, and the continued, fight for equality that is in our nation today, all the way up to the Lilly Ledbetter Act, where we said, hey, a woman needs to be paid just as equally as a man does. And it's interesting that a brother of a male fraternity got up and gave this program. I guess one thing you could look at, thankfully, is that some of the examples that you shared with me in your program, when you go to click the link for the Gillette commercial that you referenced earlier, or some of the other things that were happening in society in 2017, you can't find them anymore. They've now been
Right.
removed. So do you feel that while you didn't think at the time your presentation would have this far of an impact, do you feel that you were able to deliver something that there's been progress in what you've talked about?
Um, that's that's an interesting question, because if you look at kind of the progression through society, you did have a lot of high profile court cases. Some of those, Harvey Weinstein's back on trial, other people, their, you know, charges were dropped, or, it didn't seem like there was as much accountability. There is still, um, within smaller groups, accountability.
Mm,
Um, I go to punk and metal shows, and there is a decent amount of accountability for musicians, where if somebody in a band is not acting the way you would want, then that's when people would say, "Oh, it's cancel culture." But it definitely gets harder for those musicians to continue going. So, in kind of some of these smaller groups, I think you can still see that that's been
mm,
solidified, because it's been shown that it's, I don't want to say right, but that it is behavior that a group expects from people, and if you deviate from that, then you aren't part of that social group anymore.
yeah.
On a larger scale, like the Time's Up movement, which kind of started more of the push of go within Hollywood. In 2003, they stopped operating, so their funds had kind of dried up, and it petered out. So some of these bigger structured organizations, I think, have kind of faltered, but you do still see it within groups of people. But yeah, I mean, and we had talked earlier about, the pendulum or the wave kind of receding now, where you know, more laws are being passed to restrict rights of people,
Mm,
and that's not helping, that's for
yeah.
sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know forever, and it's one of those things where hopefully in my lifetime, we see the solution that works best for everybody moving forward. What I'm happy to see is that this is one of those things that happened where we didn't just talk about it like other things that happen in our country, and hopes and prayers were sent to the individuals affected and everybody moved on to whatever the next thing was. That there have been a series of advancements. Now, to the point that you've talked about, is here we are as modern men, and in Freemason we're pursuing those ancient mysteries that have been laid out to us through our Masonic ritual. But somewhere in the middle there is that classic definition of like, this is what being a man is all about. But a lot of that definition is tied to our grandfather's era, that greatest generation of what being a man was. And there's been a lot of change between now and then. How did you kind of cover that topic for those guys that kind of feel like they're being torn between the classic definition of manhood while wanting to embrace some of these modern expectations?
Right. I kind of traced a couple ideas in the masculinity section, because maybe it's because I had a philosophy degree, but you can't talk about it if you don't know what exactly it is that you're talking about within masculinity. And that was actually it's still kind of hard to nail down what that is. So one of the things that the Me Too movement provided was a definition of toxic masculinity.
Mm,
So these are behaviors that are not helpful. A lot of people then took that to be, well, that's what we're talking about with masculinity is, all, it should be okay to protect women. That should be, a man's function, um, that sort of thing. And it's like, well, that's still not what being a man is. And so, um, you know, looking at then some of the other examples going through history, this idea of masculinity and manliness changes. So, in presentations, I don't like having a whole wall of text. Sometimes I just have pictures, which is even less helpful. But um, there's lots of different examples throughout time of what men were expected, what was kind of the norm. And so you had in like the 20s, guys are wearing corsets and tights. So and you follow that through, you get like the 40s, like Cary Grant era, and then you get James Bond coming in, and then in the 80s everything is just like hyper masculinity with Rambo and
mm.
Rocky. And you start to get, besides this masculinity, um, still less toxic masculinity, but you get this idea of like macho ness and
So
virility.
it's funny you mentioned that. Do you watch the Amazon show Reacher at all?
I watched the first movie. I read
Oh,
an interview with Lee Child that I thought was a good interview. So I saw the movies with Tom Cruise and
okay.
Werner Herzog
Gotcha.
was the
Gotcha.
villain in one of them. But
I can't remember the name of the actor who plays Reacher now, and I'm sure that our listener is yelling, "It's this guy!" I'm like, he's just this big, larger than life dude. I mean, he looks
in
like
the
he,
books, yeah,
yeah,
that was a controversy of
yeah,
casting Tom Cruise, who's this
yeah,
role.
yeah. They went from Mighty Mouse to a guy that looks like he'd be a starting tackle or offensive lineman on a pro team. But it's funny you talked about that masculinity part, because when I talk about the show with like to coworkers or friends, and they're like, "Oh, you watch this?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's kind of silly. It's definitely one of those like made for TV series that you can tell came from like a book and then a movie." But here's the interesting thing: it's like the Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, tough guy action heroes that we would remember seeing in those cheesy, campy 80s, 90s movies. But he doesn't say the things that those guys would have said. And it's always the female love interest in that series that makes the first move, which, as guys, I can tell you, we know that is completely fictional, right?
Right.
But it is interesting to see how this movement, people are becoming aware of it. So I'm happy to see some bit of progress that, I don't know, maybe you'll feel this way too, that we're getting to a healthier definition of what a man is. Like, you can still be this muscular or not guy. You can still do these quote unquote traditional or stereotypical manly roles, but it's okay if you're sensitive or if you show compassion. That's not a sign of weakness anymore.
Right, and that's kind of the big issue with toxic masculinity, is that showing emotion or weakness is a feminine trait and to be shunned. And you know especially with media now, like movies and TV shows, you do get, um, it's moving slowly, but stronger women or female characters, more people of color in roles. And, as usual, you get both sides of that pendulum of, oh, these companies are going woke. But, if you look around, you're going to get a mix of people in places. So it is more representative of society. And yeah, it doesn't matter in terms of like a story or a movie.
Mm,
um think about kind of what the character is saying or doing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a man doing it. It could be anybody doing it. It could be the female character who's the hero. um, and having that spread out, whereas in Rambo, there's two, three. Actually, I might, it might still be more of the hot shots where there actually is a love interest. I don't know
Oh,
if there's as much of a love interest in Rambo.
Charlie Sheen reference. That's a
Yeah,
first.
yeah.
That's a
but yeah, in culture that like you and I grew up consuming, it was the guy's taking charge and doing everything, and he gets the girl at the end.
Mm.
And that's definitely changed, which is good because it's not that accurate.
Mm. There's a part of your presentation, Brother Tim, that really spoke to me as a Freemason, and it was later on where you talk about, as I like to say, the men in suits section of the presentation. And personally, it kind of kills me when I see the guys that I work with. They show up in like blue jeans, tennis shoes, not t-shirts, but untucked polo shirts, just a very casual, like we don't even use the word business anymore. It's just completely casual. And then I go to lodge and I see brothers that are in, here in DC, the dress code is a black suit with a black tie and a white dress shirt with black socks and black shoes. It's very clear. And we all go in there and it looks like a Men in Black convention, right? And it's funny because of all things, like we are instructed on how to wear our apron, and in some jurisdictions, the meaning behind why we wear aprons at certain stages in our Masonic career. But it's never really explained to us like why we wear the dark suit and tie. So if it is the quote unquote gentleman's uniform, do you feel that we're heading to a place where the only time you'll ever see a guy in a suit is him walking into a Masonic lodge or temple hall?
All right, yes, that's definitely the most interesting question that came up from that, because that was in the original presentations just kind of something that I saw that was an interesting thing to think about, but I never really dwelled on it. And I think it also depends on the lodge that you're a part of. So there are still some lodges that are not tuxedos or dark suits, and in Maryland it's a dark business suit, but for me, I like wearing the suits to lodge. And when I first started working in the office, I was wearing button down shirt and nicer pants. Now if I go into the office because I work from home, I'm wearing a band t-shirt and jeans. So
Nice.
and growing up listening to punk rock and that sort of thing, which still has its own fashion anyway. It definitely was more of a, hey, remember, it's the internal, not the external, that matters. And so I always kind of liked pushing that a little bit. It's like, oh, is masculinity having a big beard? What about having long hair? Like, pick or choose. But um so yeah, the idea with the suit, that's also something that you can trace through, again, probably through our parents or grandparents,
Mm.
where I don't know how long, when tuxedos first came around, there would have been, your suits essentially, where you'd have like your jacket and your top coat and everything. But to me, it is a little bit of a progression of more fashion than anything with the suits. And I think that article, that might have been from the BBC, but it was talking about GQ magazine. So just like a Gentleman's Quarterly, which, like, the men's magazines of I guess it would have been like the 2000s, like the Maxims and those magazines, where it becomes more of just fashion as maybe attractiveness, but more
Hmm.
fashion is consumerism. And so within lodge, um, you'll get guys who kind of worry that, oh, I can't afford a tuxedo. And, you don't want to be like, oh, well, you got to wear a tuxedo to be a Mason. So, it could have been one of the just ways to separate people within Masonry, of like, well, if you don't have money to buy a tuxedo, then maybe look for other hobbies. But
Mm.
there's also guys, I grew up on a farm, or working on a farm. I didn't grow up on a farm, but it was down the street from my house. And I worked there for 13 years. So the only times I wore suits were for funerals. And you get a lot of guys like that who, It's funerals or lodge are the times they wear suits. And um, most, depending on who you are and what you're doing, that's probably the only times you're going to be wearing suits.
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
No, I
and
agree.
and
I think if you're like me, the only time you wore a suit was it was one of your dad's.
right, yeah,
And all of that was ill fitting and smelled
yeah,
like him. So it wasn't something you really particularly look forward to.
yeah. And I mean, yeah, just thinking about that, where it's the Goodwill suit, it's not tailored or anything. But
Oh
even
yeah.
now, something strange has happened with my tuxedo, where it appears to have shrunk. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that thing is just like busting at the seams half the
It's
time. So
because you don't have it in a plastic bag and all the air got in there and dried up all the fabric. That's what you got to tell your wife. Yeah.
most likely, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, yeah, I wear a tuxedo, but it's it's beat. I need a new one. But yeah. So if it's still part of this gentleman's dress code, um, my tuxedo is not a very good representation of that. But again, to me, it just circles back to it should be the internal, not the external.
Mm. So of course, I know worshipful brother Tim Sheils. I've sat in lodge with him at his lodge, Silver Spring, and lodge number 215 in Silver Spring, Maryland. I found you in this program, as I mentioned, before we started recording. I've seen you give other programs in your lodge. They're usually more on esoteric topics, but I found this to be pretty fascinating. Thanks to our friend Robert Johnson with the Whence Came You podcast. He created the Speakers Bureau. So long story short, if you would like to have Tim come to your lodge and speak about this or any of his other topics, look in the notes for this episode. We'll make sure that you can find that link to have that connection and maybe book them. My other hope is that anyone who's listened to at least 5 minutes of any of our podcast episodes here on Craftsmen Online, they've heard that men coming into our lodges or wanting to join the ancient and gentle craft of Freemasonry, they're all being pulled in for different reasons, but then they kind of have that common mindset once they become a Mason because they understand the benefits of like what we provide, not only to our lives and personal development, but our families and our lodges and our communities. My question for you, brother, is how are you concerned now, as we look back on the program that you delivered, about how Freemasonries and just Freemasons in general as a male fraternity, how are we going to be viewed by future generations?
Yeah, that's it is an interesting question. And there's two parts of that I've always kind of found interesting. One, we host blood drives in our lodge, and it's in our social hall where we have our wall of past masters portraits. um and so
Mm,
people at the blood drive, because we're usually there, a bunch of us will give blood, but you kind of see people looking at them, and it's like, just row after row of old white guys.
I was
And
gonna say and unfortunately that's the picture that's common in a lot of our Masonic
right.
cults. Yeah.
So, and I am glad that we do have a diverse lineup of worship masters now, once I finish editing their portraits so we can print them. But it is kind of that mentality of, you talked about that from your grandfather's or father's generation, with the idea of being a gentleman, of being a man. And it's still kind of, I think, that same idea that
Mm,
most people have of it. On the flip side as well, what I do mention to people is, I'm the past president of the Maryland Masonic Research Society as well, which is it's not affiliated with any Grand Lodge. And as such, it deals with Masons of all walks. So there's co-Masons, there's women Masons in this group. And, I've given this presentation to that group as well. Um, so there are outlets for women who want to be Masons. And again, circles back to kind of one of the big questions about masculinity and Freemasonry, of if, you know, Blue Lodge, United Grand Lodge of England affiliated Masonry is remaining this fraternity, like, what as men are we talking about that, we don't want women around?
mm,
And so that should be where we are able to let, if it's, we can't talk about it with our families, that should be where, as men, you can talk about some of these concerns, some of these worries you have. And so I think if you're going to keep it as fraternities that are, because I looking again into that is fraternities aren't necessarily all male, even though from like the college idea you have the fraternity and sorority, but it's generally just an organization for mutual benefit. So if one of the aspects of Masonry that most people are affiliated and familiar with, what as men are we doing and talking about and learning and teaching that is like just for men,
That's a good point. And it kind of got me thinking, because the thing that I look at, and I'm not being critical when I say this, but I feel like today people look, when you say, "Oh, I'm a Freemason," and they look at you like you're chasing an old relic,
Yeah,
because they picture like Freemasonry, either that's going to be the American Revolution, what they know about the Freemasons that were there as the founding fathers, or they have that picture of a Freemason with a top hat and a walking cane and a long coat and a fancy mustache. And somebody that I'm picturing would be from like the late 19th, early 20th century kind of guy.
right.
Sadly, they don't picture people our age. They may think of an older family member, usually, as you mentioned, like kind of around the grandfather age, like, oh yeah, my grandfather or an uncle or something. And they look at somebody like me and they're like, why are you doing this? Like, what are you getting
Right.
out of this? Right. And to that point, it's these discussions, because as I mentioned earlier, like Freemasonry has been around since essentially the beginning of time, right? And we've been through all of these changes in society and in life, and somewhere behind that was kind of this quiet group of men that were just doing the thing, all of the things in the background. So I imagine this topic isn't going to be the first time it's ever been discussed, at least in this forum, but I'm sure that there's a worshipful master or maybe a brother that would like to stand up and have an open discussion in their lodge, maybe a program on this same subject. What advice do you have for them so that that evening produces a positive outcome?
I mean, a big part of it is going to be know your audience, right? So if you're in a lodge in a more conservative area, um, I mean, chances are you're not going to go this route with your with your presentation. But so it's kind of just you know rhetoric, right? It's what do you want to tell people and how are you going to tell them? Um, so if you want to get a certain point across, um, we've got the liberal arts and sciences for that, but it's at least try to make it personal and how it applies to you. If people disagree with it, the benefit of masonry is that we get people from everywhere in different walks of life. So um, look into some of those strengths, but also understand that your point of view isn't necessarily the only one too. So um, you know the benefit in masonry is unlike Facebook where after a while you can tell people's politics pretty easily. You can still figure them out, but usually using that venue. And then when you're in lodge, you are still just brothers, and I think that is kind of a forgotten part that um, there are different points of view. There's different ideas about things, but hopefully if it is something like, hey, you shouldn't be catcalling people on the streets
Mm.
or um, you know treat people with respect, that's kind of one of those just whispering good counsel kind of times.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I start thinking, so you had mentioned your son, when you did this presentation, was like what, 3 years
Yeah, it would have
old?
been 2, yeah.
So now he's 9, 7, 8, 9,
8, yeah,
8.
8.
Okay. So not having that conversation yet about girls, at least the big conversation.
No, no.
No, you're still at the be nice to everybody, don't pull hair, keep your finger out of your nose kind of conversations.
Yeah.
It's funny
He's
because
gotten better about the nose.
yeah. I used to think that was going to be my son's full-time job. He always had his finger up there. But I think about this with my son, and he's 18 years old, and I feel like young men now are on a delayed entry program into exploring girls, right?
Right.
Or exploring romance. Honestly, I find myself catching myself when I speak about these things, because it's not just one thing anymore. It could be many things. And when he does ask for advice in his own way, because each generation handles things a little bit differently now. Sometimes it's something veiled through a text message, or we actually have a face to face and make sure that there's nobody around. um I immediately think back to the advice that my dad would have given me, and how awkward those moments were, and how can I make this less awkward for him. But I also find myself catching it and saying, well, that's not really appropriate anymore. I mean, there's certain traditions where, a man should offer, I use the word, a man should offer to pay for dinner. A man should offer to open doors, but don't be offended if the young lady that you're with or the other person that you're with does these things. Like, I think people still respect some of the traditions that are involved, but it's not something that has to be there all the time, like out on display. And maybe that's part of like a healthy byproduct that could come from some of these discussions in lodges, is other men, other fathers, like just talking about, geez, what's it like these days? How do you have these conversations? That's super helpful. Oh, we had a disconnect. He's back. What point did you lose me at there? I can't hear you. No. Uh-oh.
Muted.
There we go.
There we go. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, this was, it said 2 hours left, and then that promptly dropped once I started
Oh,
talking.
your headphone. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, yeah. So, we kind of been talking about, it cut off talking about giving your son kind of this advice with relationships.
So I feel like having this kind of open dialogue or just discussion at lodge, because I find myself self-editing now, where I'm like, oh well, my dad would have said this, but I some of these terms aren't relevant anymore. Matter of fact, they could just be offensive. And I got to be mindful of this. Like now, when I talk to him, like, hey, Mikey, who's the cutest girl in your school? And he's like, ugh. I'm like, okay, who's the cutest dude at your school? I don't care. Like, who's somebody that you have an interest in? And he's like, what? But I find that this is a good benefit of Freemasonry, where you have other men, other dads potentially in the room, that you can talk about this, where you can say, like, how do we want our young men to be when they should be the ones next in line giving the advice?
Right. And for me, a lot of those conversations generally just happen after lodge. Where you find out, like, like, okay, yeah, kids will eventually outgrow the finger up the nose phase. They will eventually, get better at lifting up the toilet seat, and in theory. But it's thinking back, I was one of 7 kids, so I don't know how often my parents felt like having those conversations with us. um but I do at least make sure, and I've told my son, I've got 2 of them now, that, if you have questions about anything, ask. And the first, you don't want to shame them about anything, but there'll be times where, well, that's time has since passed, but we're driving in the car and it'll show the titles of songs. And so there was, some sort of inappropriate song, and he's just like, what does, and says the word, because he can at least read. He's like, what does that mean? I was like, well, that just means that this band doesn't like New York. And he's like, why are you skipping that song? But it's, he threw it out there because there at least wasn't the shame attached to it yet. So it's like, well, you're gonna hear stuff, people are gonna say stuff, but you don't do it. And eventually that'll work for a little while. But for me, it would just be making sure to have that openness with the kids. And then with your within lodge, some lodges will have the sickness and distress. Some lodges, I saw one worshipful master try to kind of do the opposite too, of like, what good stuff has happened to you lately. And so I think building in more of those moments within a standard lodge meeting, that could at least help grow the fraternity. And I think within the lodge itself, you could have a little bit more of that connection with people, and more people you could talk to about stuff. So I mean, that's not something that you see often in lodge, but again, that circles back to what are we doing in lodge? What are we talking about? You know, besides minutes and paying bills, or talking about famous Freemasons, like what are we doing with that?
Yeah.
Where can we go from there? And you know, most people, you know, you go to the lodge meeting and it's like, all right, how much longer is this? But you know, having those conversations after is nice, but it yeah, it is something that I think would be a nicer feature to have within more lodge meetings.
It's funny you say that. I just think of, I mean, at my lodge in DC here, I know that if I came in and said, "Hey, we're going to have a conversation tonight. Our program is on Me Too, Masculinity, and Freemasonry," I think guys would be like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." Um, I'm interested to see how things would be received back in my mother lodge in upstate New York, where things can be a little bit more conservative there. And as you said, like knowing the audience and having a plan, I think part of it would be, to any brother that's listening, before you spring this on your lodge, probably a good idea to have a conversation with the worshipful master that year, unless it happens to be you.
Yeah,
Um,
then you
but
do what you
still,
want.
yeah, I would still, as you said, like I proceed with caution, because you're not trying to insult or shame somebody for their ideas. But you're trying to do your best to whisper that wise counsel to them.
Right, and with, you know, Me Too, the Me Too movement, the whole, you know, one of the main features of it was, you know, masculinity isn't bad, it's toxic masculinity. It's these behaviors that degrade others. And, you know, you'd think that would be a pretty easy lift of like, okay, that's, you know, but you get that pushback of like, no, I'm, you know, such a virile man that I need to be able to just, you know, be a pickup artist and go compliment women. It's like that's not your job. Your point of view is not the most important thing in the world. And you know, luckily, I mean, I haven't met many people like that in Masonry, but um, you know, there was a quote in there of, you know, it's one thing for the women to put their foot down and say, no, this is unacceptable, but other men need to be the ones correcting each other too. So, um, you know, again, that's that whispering good counsel.
It's a great point to end this one. I really appreciate the extra time that you gave us, dying headphones and all. Worshipful brother Tim Sheils, thanks so much for your time on this episode of the Craftsman Online Podcast.
Yep. Thank you.